Okay, so let's start for day 2 of this workshop. And in case any people are new and wasn't here yesterday, my name is Frank Zhang, and I'm a faculty member in the Division of Artificial Intelligence in Medicine at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Yeah, so first of all, just a brief recap of what this workshop is about. During the first day of our workshop, we covered how CNNs work, especially other to model genomic sequences. We covered how the basic operators in CNN actually the underlying math, how it works, how do you do the summations and multiplications, and we build the CNNs with both TensorFlow/Keras and PyTorch. And in the end, we wrap up with model evaluations. And today we're going to talk about more in this automated machine learning and wrap up with model explanation techniques. And in order to do that, for automated machine learning, we're going to introduce some basics about reinforcement learning and how we applied neural architecture search to automate CNN tuning. And in the end, we will interpret the model because, for genomics, we input DNA sequences. We want to output not just a number of accuracy, but also some biological insights. And again, the coding part of this workshop is entirely implemented in Google Colab, which is a free and reproducible modern deep learning platform. So if you go to this GitHub repository, find day 2 Jupyter Notebook and click on Open Colab, this will take you to a new running instance of a cloud-based GPU-enabled Jupyter Notebook environment. And for today's work, we'll be mostly focusing on day 2 of this notebook. And the way it works is that I will be discussing some basics, and at each breakpoint, I want you to go on this Google Colab, run this basic code already implemented in it. And if once you finish that, you should try to explore the practice questions. And I think I already know who's taking this for course credits. So just again, for you, those extended practices will be graded. So please send your finished results to my email address by the end of next Friday. So, okay, that's good enough for some interest. Just a recap for what we did yesterday, right? We covered how convolution, pooling, flattened, and fully connected layers work in a convolutional neural network. And we also covered how to implement a CNN in Keras and PyTorch, and the model achieved a testing performance of 0.79. So apparently this is not good enough. And I wonder if any of you was able to get a performance that's better than 0.79. Yeah.
I got only
8.1.
Yeah, changing the batch size.
Changing the batch size.
With the channel, the number of channels.
Number of channels. You mean the kernel size, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Change from 32 to change it to 4.
That's a great insight, and we will see like how this can also be discovered during our automated machine learning. Anyone else tried this? I guess online. I don't even know how many people are online right now.
I had another one.
11.
11. What does 11 mean?
Oh, you have 11 participants online.
Okay, thank you. All right. Yeah, but yeah, what were we saying?
I had another convolution level and increased allowed 40 epochs and you got like 4.97.
0.97. Oh, that's very close to almost perfect separation. But I guess just keep in mind that this is simulated data. So if you actually get like even perfect 0.99.99, that's okay because there's absolutely no noise in this data, and we should be able to get that. But in real world cases, that's if you see an accuracy that's 99.99, that's absolutely a red flag that this is overfitting and it's not right. But just to be clear, this is simulated data and it's okay. But I guess the major question we are facing always is, can we build a better model, right? Given a data set, can we do better than what we already have? So in today's topic, we'll mostly be covering how we can automate this process by searching a group of models defined in a model space, and also try to interpret models after the process of AutoML, because we always want to interpret an accurate model, not a crappy model. So I guess as we've already discussed, when you change the model architecture, right, in a CNN, it actually will influence your model's performance. And this is not new. The performance of CNNs are known to be reliant on the model's architectures. So this is probably most studied in computer vision and image analysis. So for example, like in the last decade, there are a lot of famous convolutional neural network architectures. So for example, this VGG is a stack of 19 layers, convolutional blocks and polling blocks. And later on, this residual neural network introduces those skip connections. That's what you see, those curved arrows. And by introducing those residual connections or skip connections, you can go much, much deeper than the neural networks that doesn't have those sort of residual connections. And there are also specialized architectures that are specifically good for certain tasks. So for example, this U-shaped net, it's called UNet, and it's been demonstrated to be very successful in image segmentations. And those inception layers have those branched structures with the underlying idea that different kernel size can capture different image patterns of different granularities. So, and the same things has also been observed in genomics, right? So for example, on the left is one of the latest development of applying CNNs to model genomics. It has a dilated convolutional layer that can significantly enlarge the receptive field. So receptive field means what is the local window your model will be looking at. In the middle is this informer model that couples the convolutional neural network with self-attention. It's a transformer-like model. Again, this enlarges the range of interactions the model can learn from, such as those enhancer-promoter interactions, which is, like linearly is far away, but once you introduce this attention between them, you can directly learn those interactions. On the very right, we have this CRISPR net, right? So not only we can learn those natural occurring molecular phenotypes, we can also learn some, external determinants such as CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing. For this particular one, the middle part is this inception layer, which we just introduced in the previous slide, is invented for image analysis. It also includes this bidirectional long short-term memory layer, which is a special form of a recurrent neural network that are good at learning these long-range dependencies. So all these different architectures are being developed for specific tasks, right? So, and the reason is, of course, first is the architecture will have an influence for the model's performance. But there's something even special and important for biomedicine. So the first one, in my opinion, is we are facing a slightly different challenge, right? So in genomics and biomedicine, we have a lot of like mountains of data, but often they are highly heterogeneous, right? So they have inherent noises, that's one thing. And second, they're generated by different experimental techniques, right? So they represent different data modalities. For example, if you use the same model for single-cell RNA-seq gene expression profiles and bulk RNA-seq gene expression profiles, they may not work equally well, right? The reason being that single cells has a lot of like dropout and zero inflations. So things like this makes it really hard to scale up a model in a way that's can be done for like image analysis or natural language processing. And secondly, the predictions we make for using the deep learning models in genomics and biomedicine are usually comes with a high stakes, right? So when we try to interpret the effect of a genetic variation that is specific to a patient, it's really has to be confident and interpretable. So in that regard, it's more important to have a trustworthy model compared to generating a paragraph. So after talking all about those CNN architectures, we haven't really given it a formal definition. So what is actually a CNS architecture? So as far as this workshop is concerned, the architecture can be mostly separated into two components, right? So the first one is operators. So operators is basically what sort of a computation operations you will put on this layer by layer basis. For example, we cover the convolution, pooling, flatten, and fully connected. And as I showed you yesterday, each of those type of operators can have a different type of parameters. And like for flatten, you can have a vanilla flatten or global average pooling or global max pooling. And the second part is called wiring, right? So wiring is basically how you connect those different layers together. This is mostly important in the realm of residual connections or skip connections. And for simplicity in this workshop, we're only considering the operators, like the ones that you guys have been trying, such as changing the kernel size or adding or removing a layer. Okay, any questions so far? So if no, we're going to introduce a Python package that is built on top of Keras and PyTorch to automate this process of architecture search. And it's called Ember. Ember is basically a modularized AutoML package specifically designed for genomics and biomedicine. And the reason why we're interested in that is because it actually can achieve state-of-the-art search efficiency, especially in those one-dimensional tasks. So if you look at this table here, this is a benchmark study done by an independent group that is published in New Rips this year. So in this paper is called the Neural Architecture Search, or NAS Bench 360. It benchmarked a neural architecture search algorithms for a variety of different tasks, and among them is Ember. So when we compare Ember to the other searching algorithms, we see that Ember can really achieve the best performance among those searching competitors. Okay, so this wide residual neural network and this denseness random, those two are even more like baseline. They're not searching the architectures, but just randomly sampling. Okay, so basically this table tells us that using Ember, we can really achieve the best performance, much better than these randomly sampled architectures, but also better than the other searching algorithms. And there are mostly two useful components in Ember. And the first one is Ember Architect, which is an implementation of different searching methods. And the second component is called Ember Modeler, which converts a list of operators to a deep learning model that's just the way we implemented yesterday. And this part is framework agnostic, so you can implement in either Keras or in PyTorch without changing any of the code. Yep. Oh, it's a state of the art. And as I mentioned, Ember can be really applied to a variety of different one-dimensional tasks. So for example, in genomics, we have applied Ember to study CRISPR-Cas9 repair outcomes. And this work is actually done by a high school intern student. And when we take this one hot encoded matrix as input and try to predict the 6 editing outcomes, we were able to show that by training on the same previously published data, we can beat the other methods by a very large margin, as shown in this table here. And in healthcare data, such as electrocardiograms, which is typically done to measure your heart functionality, This is applied by this independent group at Carnegie Mellon University. And they were again able to show that Amber was able to achieve a very high predictive power compared to other searching algorithms. So the way this architecture search method works is we first need to define a model space. So a model space refers to a list of, I guess in Python's words, it's a list of lists, right? So each list, the list is each element in the list is corresponds to a layer, and each layer itself is also a list because you have a different candidate operators. So when we design this model space, we still need to consider the general order, right? So you have to put convolution operators first, and then followed by a pooling or convolution. And in the end, you need this flatten before it can go to the dense layer. And this again goes back to our discussions of the shapes yesterday, right? So you want to keep the shape consistent, even though you don't need to worry about the input dimensionalities as you would do in PyTorch, but you can't feed a matrix to a layer that only takes a vector as input. So, yeah, are you having trouble seeing the slides?
I'm just reading the code.
Yeah, so if you go to the GitHub repository, I think that might be better, yeah, easier for you, yeah.
I have a quick question. So, two questions actually. The first one is, in the previous slide when you were talking about a model, they were building a model that they try to predict CRISPR editing outcome based on genetic data. I thought when you do CRISPR experiment, you kind of have like a target of which regions of the genome you want to modify. What's the point of having a prediction model for that?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So basically, there's a little bit of a missing biological background here. So as you probably are aware, CRISPR-Cas9 will find a target region and introduce this double-strand break into the target region, right? So, but there won't be any like floating DNAs in your cell because we have this DNA repair system. So once the DNA repair system detects this double-strand break, a set of enzymes will be recruited to the break site and try to stitch them together. And this is just recently there has been discovered that the repair outcomes, right? So once you have this cut, the repair outcomes, the repair products, is actually dependent on the local sequence, right? So you introduce this cut here versus there. At one place, you will have, say, a one base pair insertion with a probability of 90%. The other place is only, say, 40%. And this gives you the basis of predicting the repair outcomes based on the local sequence. Yeah, that's why, like, our input is the, the target DNA sequence, and we're predicting the repair outcome probabilities. Yep. Yeah, so I guess in terms of defining a model space, again, it's very simple. It's just a list of lists. Each element is a layer, and each layer is another list that concludes different operations, right? So and you define an operation by parsing this operation, making an instance of this operation class implemented in Amber. So there is one special operator that we need to pay special attention to, which is this identity operation. Identity operation basically doesn't do any actual computing, right? It just removes there and perform this ID mapping. So this gives us the ability to define a really complex model space. And during this search phase, overcomplicated models will be penalized. And by selecting this identity layer, we can actually build a simpler model from a more complex model space. And that has been a very important area for this data-driven architecture design. So yeah, we've discussed this, how to make a model space. So, but the model space mostly just, it's a contains the moving parts of your CNN model. Aside from the moving parts, we still have this fixed input and output operations. And the input and output operations are really like, you don't change that. It's determined by your input feature shape and output label shape. In our simulated data, like the input is 200 base pair by 4 channels, right? It's 200 or 250. I don't remember for sure. 200. Okay. Yeah, but in other cases, you may have like 1,000 base pair or 4,000 base pair. Then you will need to fix your input dimensionalities according to your input feature size. And for the output, we're just predicting a 0-1 binary label. But in cases there are other labels, we need to change the shape accordingly. And specifically for the output, we also need to find the correct activation functions, right? So for example, if you're predicting a continuous value for a regression task, the activation is simply just linear, right? It goes from negative infinity to positive infinity. But if it is a binary classification, we typically use a sigmoid. And sigmoid can also be used when you have this multi-label classification, which means you have multiple 0-1s and you can have more than one for any input feature. And I'll explain this in the next slide. But for this, more frequently, we'll have this multi-class classification where you have all zeros except for one class that is one, right? So for this, we have activation as a softmax. So what's the difference between multi-label and multi-class? So basically, here's found this cute illustration online. So for binary classification, given the same input features or image, you're only interested in predicting 1 or 0, right? It's only competing between 2 classes. But for multi-class, you have multiple competing categories, and the probability of them sum up to 1. And in this case, you can have 50% of a dog versus 40% of a plant. But in multi-label, you can have multiple ones. This is where you will see like there's both dog and plant will have a relatively high probability. So now we have defined the model space and also the fixed, the input and output operations. We can actually sample an architecture or a model from the model space. So in this specific case, for example, I'm interested in sampling the simple CNN model that we built yesterday. What I would do is I would parse this input architecture tokens of 0061 to another function called sequential model builder. So sequential model builder is this function that takes in architecture token and converts that to a model. So I guess I want to put a little more emphasis on what this input architecture means. So input architectures are a list of integers. So each integer will correspond to the corresponding element in your layer list. So 0 basically means the 0 index element for the first layer, which is a convolutional 1D layer with ReLU activation and 32 filters. And element of 6 on the third location means for the third layer, we will take this the last operation, which is identity. So we don't want to include the convolution layer for the third layer. Remember that yesterday we didn't include a second convolution layer to build the CNN model. I guess more importantly, as we discussed yesterday, so building a CNN model in Keras is relatively easy. You don't need to write that many code. Versus in PyTorch, it's a little bit more tedious. So as I mentioned, one of the advantages of this sequential model builder is that it's framework agnostic, meaning that you can change your model from a Keras implementation to a PyTorch implementation without changing any of the code. So what you do is you just run this members command line interface or CLI and config change your backend from PyTorch to TensorFlow 2. So in this way, Ember really enables unified syntax, coding syntax that is like seamlessly switchable between TensorFlow 1, 2, and PyTorch. So how are we doing on time? Okay, so it's 30 minutes. So I think for today's practice, I think we'll put more emphasis on the actual coding part. So I'll put around 15 minutes for each practice session. And once you're finished, you can work on these additional questions that are put up in the slides.
Yeah. So is that identity acting like you put it into a layer and then it will pick the best optimal structure for that specific layer?
Yes. So for example, if that will actually fix additive before this layer, then we don't really need this layer. The overall topic is about it.
And you put like identity across all of the layers to pick the best model?
Yeah, but that will actually drop the shapes, right? For example, like the dense layers only takes the vector as input. So for the flattening operators, you can use after some sort of flatten that converts the matrix to a vector.
Thank you.
They're a good way to know like what your options are for each location, like for the first in the four sequence vector, the first one I like telling you that actually the middle of the outer range. Is it just but the third one has 6. The arm 6 lines here. I'm trying to match up. So it's 0 is the first one. But this one is 6, but is 6 like choose the last one or
I believe 6 goes the last one, but might be this is
then I think that's going to be good.
first layer, we don't have 6 challenges to choose from as well. I think one way to
Oh, I think I must have, so there are 6 here. There's 2 over there. Okay. I think I must have there was a relation to 3 or 4. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you can always use like the list of items to see on the All right, any questions? Are you able to run this without any issues?
I didn't add a big token. The art,
Uh-huh.
it seems like I should have to.
Yeah, because we need to give the model builder like an instruction about which element it should be taken from each layer.
But it's not giving me error for.
Wait, did you? Also, it's still work. What is being selected? So if you don't provide for this element. You're expected to provide this element how there's, yeah. Yep. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, feel free to ask questions on that thing, why we have this practice with 3 seconds. So yeah, so the most up-to-date slide will be uploaded to the GitHub repository afterwards. Just okay, keep updating it last Wednesday. Yeah.
Your graph that shows the weight of the layer choices that changes that it is like something magic happens after 5 steps. So initially everything happens forward. After 5 steps and everything diverges. So
We'll come to that today, and that's the full slide. Yeah, but you're right. Basically, initially it's learning that he doesn't really know which value language. So that's why like it's uniform something, but the reason why it starts that we're talking about because we have this initial buffer stage. So we don't want to make a decision of which one is better. By just say C, let's say one or two models. We want to become an initial group of models, become a comparison model. Sure. The ARC tokens, right? Yeah. Yeah, so I guess to explain the ARC tokens, let's go back to the definition of model space, right? So as I mentioned, model space is basically just a list of a Python list of lists, right? So the outer list is the from here to here, and then each element is another list, and this list corresponds to all the candidate operators for this convolutional one layer, right? And then if you for this position, if you select a 0, that means we're taking the zeros position operator out to build a model, right? So for example, if I choose 0 here, then in the second position, it's taking out max pooling 1D. But you can also choose 1. So if you choose 1, then you're taking out average pooling 1D to build a model. And the same applies to the later layers. So you're just giving it the indices to take out to build a model for each of those layers.
If you wanted to go to all the comments, would you just do a loop or something? Like if you say you want to like try all the possible comments.
Yeah, that's a great point. So basically the most naive searching, no searching, it's just like exhaustive algorithm is to do all the combinations, right? Yes, so and in this 4-layer model space, we have around 378 total combinations.
Follow-up question on that then. So from the 370 possible. So what is the step that's in each step? Does it choose one from it or does it try out many different things?
Oh,
Yeah, usually 16 steps. Does it mean it tried out 16 out of those? Or
so in each step, you can define a number of models you want to sample from it. And in this case, I think it's either 3 or, yeah, I think it's 3.
so each step actually have tried many different combinations.
Right. And we'll in the later slides, we'll see how it chose to choose different combinations.
I'm still a little bit confused about the purpose of the arc. Like, how does it serve to like master chose the model?
Right. So
Like, how do you define initial optimal arc?
yeah, so I guess in the initial way, we don't really know, right? In this case, I'm just showing you like hypothetically, if we know arc token, how this component can be used to convert this architecture token to a CNN model. And in the later parts, we'll actually talk about how we generate those this list of architecture tokens. Yeah.
Okay, so like basically, so this token just represents the structure of the scan.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. And token basically just means like which of those candidates you want to take out to build your model.
I see.
Yeah.
So this just means that you only have one layer of the function.
Right. So by choosing 6, you will only have 1 layer. But for example, here you also choose 0, then you will have a 2 convolution list. Yeah.
Can you mix layer types within each little thing?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
I'm guessing. So I want to go in that, but I know it's like this. But I don't know which type of. I don't know what parameters classes.
Wait, by mixing layers, are you saying like you want to mix pooling layers with convolution layers?
Like in the first set of brackets, you can have a convolution, a max pool, and a global average pool or something like that, all in one.
Yes. So the problem with that is you just have to keep the shape.
The shapes.
Yes. As long as the shapes are consistent, you can do that.
So it came around from the back end. Fix it for you.
No, I mean if the shapes are inconsistent and like no one can fix it for you. It's just like the Paros can automatically compute the correct shape for you, versus Python expect you to provide the correct shape to them to it. Yeah. Yeah. So in this specific case, I think you can mix pooling with convolution, but you can't mix pooling with flatten because flatten changes the shape.
Which is this for? Here's actually here's built on top of temperature flow, right? And it said the options for like temperature flow 1, temperature flow 2, high voltage.
Yeah. So I guess in this Google Colab, because like Google Colab has phased out TensorFlow 1, so you cannot use TensorFlow 1 anymore. But for TensorFlow 2, we're actually calling Keras layers to build a model.
Go to its
Yeah. Yeah, hope this is clear because it's kind of important that we understand the concept of model space. You know, like we have for each layer, we can predefine a set of candidates, right? As you mentioned, you can probably also mix and match different types of layers. We can also include this special type of layer called identity, so that we can remove a layer. But a general rule of thumb is you have to keep the shapes consistent. Otherwise, the model won't be built. So any questions from our online audience? You've been pretty quiet.
So a
Yep.
question regarding the 378 combinations for the model. In reality, how like you run each combination to get the best performance out of the model you build, or there is a sort of best practice? You start with what, and then how, like in practice, how do you do this?
Yeah, that's the whole purpose of the architecture search. No, by the way, I think is that you're getting ahead of the slides. Basically, you're way ahead of the the ideas. So basically, if you are an experienced machine learning practitioner, you may be able to find a good combination depending on your understanding of the data characteristics and some you know, how those different layers work. But it's really like it's an art, you know, it's an art. It's based on experience. This is why we actually provide this package to efficiently search this model space, because we start from an unbiased way. And as I will show you in the later slides, this can actually be quite efficient. So this whole 400 model spaces can be explored in less than 1 minute to find a good enough model. So there is no guarantee that this is the best model, but as you will see for this simulated data, it's actually quite close to that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can this automated idea be applied to other like machine learning models, such as a tree? Or...
Yeah, so for a tree, it's actually much easier because you know the number of hyperparameters for a tree is probably just the number of trees and how deep each tree is. So it's like a 2D grid that you can either do an exhaustive search or basically the complexity will be much lower. And indeed, it has been done. But using some different optimizers, such as Bayesian optimization, you basically still learn from the history, but it's easier to formulate as a statistical problem because it's just it's simple. Yeah.
So I understand is that the Amber package is used for when you have like you want to build a model and you want to explore what are the base architecture, right? But usually I feel like in a lot of cases we kind of want to test multiple architecture as separate jobs on the computing cluster. So in that case, would Amber assist in like a setting like that? Because sometimes training a model can take a long time.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So first of all, Amber actually keeps all the trained models. So by the very last section of today's workshop, we will actually be able to explain the predictions from different models, right? You will see the differences between explaining the best model versus the second best or the worst model, if that answers your question. And second is to speed up the search process. So here is a really simplified version, but in reality, things got really, like as you mentioned, training each model can take several days. So it has been the best practice to not train a model to full convergence, right? So even if you trained by 3 epochs, you already see the difference. You don't need to train it to the full convergence. And even now, most recently, there are training free methods. right? You don't even need to train it. The model's performance is determined even by the at initialization. So there's some theory behind it, but that just is beyond the scope of this workshop.
Machine learning, like machine learning on machine learning.
Right,
That's
yes.
pretty-
Learning with medians for optimization.
Yes, it's called neuron tangent kernels, and it's basically computing the gradients at initialization. Yeah, but you know, like the efficient evaluation of architectures has been a key research direction in this field, mostly because neural architectures are so expensive to evaluate from the most real-world studies. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought this up. So, yeah. Okay, we have architecture tokens, and I hope you were able to implement in both PyTorch and Keras. And then as some of you have already explored yesterday, like this process of manual tuning, it could take a long time, especially when each model takes days to train. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really an art. There's not really a principled way to do it except for, you know, trial and error. And typically the way to do this is basically for any given data sets or like a given machine learning task, you would have some initial guesses, right? So you can build a model space from like implicitly a model space of your own from your experience. So you train your model and compute the model's performance using some of those evaluation metrics that we covered yesterday. And this will give you a sense of how good this model is. So for example, yesterday we got a model of 0.79. So because this is a simulated data, we know that this is nowhere near good enough, but in real world, it's typically harder to actually get a sense of whether a model of 0.79 of AUROC is good or bad, right? But still you have to just keep trying, right? Through some either experience or some random searching, you will tweak your model by adding or removing some layers or, you know, changing the hyperparameters and train another model. Compare this performance. So once you train, like say 10 models, you should be able to get a very good sense of what you're looking at. But apparently with the concept of model space, this process can be automated, right? At the bare minimum, as several of you have mentioned, we can use a for loop to iteratively and randomly sample CNNs from this given model space. And over time, we should be able to find the best model. The only problem with that is very, very computationally inefficient, especially given how expensive each model evaluation is. And we can do better by building another model. As you mentioned, it's a machine learning on top of machine learning. So basically this top layer model that learns from this history of these CNN architectures that we have trained and propose some architecture tokens that presumably would do better than just randomly sampling from the model space. And the way we do it is through this reinforcement learning, right? So we build a recurrent neural network such that we will reward the desired CNN architectures and penalize the underperforming architectures, right? So basically it's this process that's highly similar to how manual tuning is, right? We're just replacing this human manual tuning agent with a reinforcement learning agent, such that over time, hopefully, this recurrent neural network is able to propose better architecture tokens through learning from the history. So this is indeed one of these like groundbreaking papers 5 or 6 years ago, which is called neural architecture search with reinforcement learning. In a nutshell, this is a model-based approach, right? So we model this architecture token almost like a sentence. So each index, it can be considered as a word. And we're hoping to choose from a bag of word to form a sensible sentence. The reason why we use this recurrent neural network is that because the layers have dependencies, right? The choice of the next layer is highly dependent on what comes before it. So in this specific case, if we already have two convolutional layers as the first layers, what are we going to choose for the third layer? So most likely we want to choose a pooling layer. That's just sort of the conventions. Or you can choose another convolution layer, but you don't want to choose a dense layer because that disrupts your shapes, right? So this recurrent neural network basically just learns these conditional probabilities by choosing those operators in a layer by layer basis. And I guess this recurrent neural network, just one word about this recurrent neural network is that it's optimized through this reinforcement learning. Basically, it's at each time we're sampling CNN architectures, it's like this hill climbing, right? We don't get to see the whole landscape. At each step, for example, here we're sampling in the vicinity of this area and then choose the best step. So over time, this is how we will be able to climb up the hill and to maximize the reward. So I want to give you this high-level understanding of this reinforcement learning first before we actually go to the mathematical formulations. So I guess in more strict speaking, what we're trying to optimize is a function, right? It maps your input features X to your labels Y. And there are two sets of parameters to your function F. One is those omegas, which is this model's parameters trained by gradient descent. And there's a second layer of parameters that is the architectures denoted by A. So I guess in a rough sense, if you look at this control here, those omegas are the weights in your neural network, right? It's like when you want your ReLU to become non-zero versus A is the wiring and how many layers is on the like a bird eye view. Right, so in a sense that you can see those two parameters have this nested relationship, right? You first determine architecture A, and once you determine A, those you can start to train your parameters omega. And then how do we train a recurrent neural network and model the conditional probabilities of A? So again, this really goes back to the statistical learning. Basically, given the observed sequence of tokens, we're interested in predicting the next token, for example, AT, given all this previous T-1 all the way to T0 tokens, right? And this is what a recurrent neural network does, right? So it takes all those previous tokens into this hidden state by unrolling this recurrent neural network cell and try to predict this conditional probability. And I'm reusing this example in the previous slides. Basically, we're predicting the conditional probability using a recurrent neural network that accounts for two convolutional layers that is already being sampled for the first two layers. So how do we optimize the convolutional neural networks parameters denoted by theta here? So we're actually sampling those A's and evaluate its performance, such that each AT will be associated with, I guess, each AK, right? T is the index for the specific architecture token. The entire vector of tokens is noted as AK, such that each set of architecture tokens are associated with a reward arc, right? So we can compute the gradient of sampling this AK set of architectures and multiply that by a normalized version of the reward, such that this theta will be moved towards these high reward regions and moves away from the low reward regions. Okay, so this is the basics of how this reinforcement learning in the setting of a controller recurrent neural network that samples the architecture tokens. Oh, sorry. So basically, this recurrent neural network or this model that generates the architecture tokens are denoted as a controller network or just controller. Architecture tokens, yes.
Architecture tokens are like that overall structure, like the pieces that are like alpha 0, alpha 1, 2.
Right, and I guess in our specific case, it's 0061, the list of integers.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. And this is why, yeah, I hope this at least this gives you a rough understanding of what's actually happening under the hood. And I guess next we are going to see some implementations. So this is why like we don't really need to select initial architectures, because this is the job of this controller, which is another model we're going to train using reinforcement learning. So within Ember, a controller can be built by just parsing a model space. And the reason is very simple, because we need a model space to know like how many candidates are in each layer and how many layers they are. And as you will see here, when you build this architecture, you can start get actions or get architectures. The reason for being it's named as a get actions is because get actions is our jargon in the reinforcement learning field. But basically, get actions will return to a tuple of two elements. The first one is this token. Like instead of 0061, we're getting 4102, right? So this provides the initial architecture for evaluation. This is a proposal from our controller. And the reason for this one it being sampled is encoded in the next element, which is the probability. So the probability, as you can see here, is quite uniform, right? So because the controller at initialization is quite naive, it doesn't know which one is better than which. So it's just uniformly sampling from those candidate layers. And in the end, we will see through this training, as we just outlined through reinforcement learning, and moving towards high reward regions, away from low reward regions, the probability will be skewed. So I guess we want to give a very high-level overview of the different components that are necessary for Ember to perform this search. So first of all, we've already covered the search algorithm, which is the controller. So apparently you can also do other types of search algorithms other than controller. So for example, you can do a genetic algorithm. As long as there's a mechanism or a model that can propose new architecture tokens, yeah, it can serve the purpose of a search algorithm. So the proposed architecture tokens will be fed into this model manager, right? Model manager has two workers for it. The first one is the builder. Builder takes in this proposed architecture and convert that into actual CNN model, right? Then this manager will train this model and call this reward function to evaluate the model's performance. Again, this reward function, you can encode different types of things as reward. So for example, we can use AUROC, or we can also use accuracy. And one of the practices is actually asking you to change that. So, okay. So before we move on to the second practice, any questions? Yeah.
So the loss function is AUROC.
Right. So actually here, like the reward function can be loss function, right? But it has to be active because we're maximizing. Yeah. But in this case, we don't typically prefer a loss function because a loss function is less interpretable. For example, compared to accuracy, like a 99% of accuracy is more easier to understand compared to loss of like 0.02. Right, and the AURC is another metric that is similar to accuracy compared to loss. It's more easier to understand.
How do you update the parameters from the search framework, the reinforcement, like the RL structure?
Right. Yeah, so once you evaluate the rewards for a given architecture, you're going to compute the gradients. Basically, here, like, this is a likelihood model, right? So sampling, convolution, pooling, and dense will be associated with a certain likelihood, right? This likelihood is denoted by this by a condition of the current set of recurrent numerical parameters theta. So you can compute the gradient, and I guess the only difference for this reinforcement learning is that we are multiplying this gradient with this reward, so that you move towards this high reward and move away from this lower reward instead of it's always this you will give it a direction.
It's like maximizing the likelihood.
Right. Yeah.
Or MLE.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's MLE with a slight tweak of this reward consideration.
What's age that? Welcome.
Yeah. I think I have a slide misuse of notations here. So H sub t is basically the tth layers operator.
Then what's the big A that is moving average bar and intuitively why do every AK has an RK, why do
Yeah, that's a great point. So the reason why we need this moving average of R is because we want to keep a current average performance of the models, such that like for example, like AUC of 0.8 may be considered good initially, but if once you are already like in the realm of every model should perform the average of 0.9, you should actually move away from that 0.8, if that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, I guess in practice, this B is actually quite important. So you got a good point. Yeah, and actually, when you run this code, you will actually be able to see some certain architectures some certain operators are preferred initially, but as the search goes on, it actually starts to decrease. So that's probably also the reason why we want to include this bias term like the B average here. All right, so yeah, so the basic components of those Amber neural architecture search is already implemented in the code. And in the next 15 minutes, let's try to run it. The entire process should be finished around 1 minute. Just be sure to enable the GPU acceleration in your Jupyter notebook. It actually makes it quite a difference.
Running it on your computer, that in Colab is there a way to switch it from CPU to GPU or
So that's actually a whole other topic. So the reason why I chose to use Google Colab is because it's so like everything is figured out for you. Like you have the GPU backend enabled for PyTorch and TensorFlow. But if you're actually running on your own environment, I think first of all, you need to match the CUDA versions, because different like TensorFlow and PyTorch are built using different CUDA versions. CUDA is the like lower level drivers for the GPU cores. And once you have a functioning installation of either PyTorch or TensorFlow that utilizes the right version of CUDA and gives you access to the GPUs, I think it's relatively easy to work between CPUs and GPUs. For PyTorch, it's actually easier. So by PyTorch, by default, everything is on CPU. You have to call tensor.device CUDA to push that to GPU.
How do you do the first thing where you tell Colab runtime tied to GPU? Like, are they specific instruction in the notebook that I can type out?
Right. So
Oh, okay. I see. Oh, I see. Got it. Thank you.
is it already in GPU?
So I execute, but I don't know about.
Okay, okay, good. So I think it actually saves my settings. That's why like by default it's already in GPU. I think we are also supposed to take a short break. We'll come back at 3 p.m. And yeah, feel free to drink water and so that we'll short break 3 here.
So I have a quick question, how do we change the backend?
Right, so yeah, so for changing the backend, you are going to use here.
Oh, I see, I see, I see. Thank you. Maybe it's. Yeah. There's a part. I think about the fourth shoe on change one. Yeah.
Oh,
You already GPU.
Right, so I saw a question online saying that how long would it take to run these notebooks locally if we have a normal computer?
still going, computer stuff.
Um, so if you're for this simulated data, it's being designed in purpose to be extremely small. So if you're running on a normal computer like a MacBook, it should only take a few minutes to run. But in real world cases, for example, if you're training on the entire human genome, that by itself could take weeks to train. And there is more advanced techniques such as the training-free evaluation of models that I mentioned earlier in order to account for that. And it's almost never a good idea to run real-world datasets on your own computer unless like you should run this on a GPU server. Yeah.
What server does your lab have? Did you have its own GPUs or do you?
No, I think in terms of long time use, it's always better, more financially wise to purchase instead of using AWS. I guess at Cedars-Sinai we have this new computational biomedicine department where they have purchased V100, A100 GPUs, and they're quite expensive to buy. But
They were scarce too for a while, right?
they were what?
They were like shortage or something.
Yeah, I think that's. But now it's getting better. It's getting better. Yeah. And every few other years there are new GPUs coming out. Like for example, previously the V architectures, V100 is the best GPUs you can get, but later on this A architectures starts to take over, and I think earlier this year, this H100 is the newest one, and every time there's a new generation, the price almost doubles. So yeah, it's definitely a game of grants and funding. Yeah, and also I think, yeah, there's a second question about, do I prefer PyTorch or TensorFlow? I think I prefer Keras, especially before it's incorporated within TensorFlow. At that time, Keras' API has remained remarkably steady, right? It doesn't really change that much. It only changes the backend code. Before it's incorporated in TensorFlow, it supports several popular backends, including TensorFlow, Theano, and MXNet, I believe. Yeah. But nowadays, I think PyTorch has its really good advantages. For example, if you use VS Code debugger to see which like the actual values of your tensors, you can access that. So that's a big advantage of using this dynamic computation graphs. It's easier to debug, and that's precisely the reason why TensorFlow is now also in dynamic graph. You can do that with TensorFlow, but I guess just people get impatient. And if you look at the popular deep learning models and their official implementations, a lot of them are in PyTorch. So yeah, I think PyTorch, if you're new to this field, I think PyTorch is the way to go.
Like going forward, I think PyTorch is going to be.
Yeah. I think like there are rumors that even Google is switching to JAX.
Yeah.
So yeah, TensorFlow is just so messy. It doesn't have the best documentations, and yeah.
In August, when it's running, the use time is like 3% or whatever. You know what? Is it like percent of max allowed time, or?
Yes.
And how is that? Do we set that, or just the computer decide? Time of it's better.
Yeah, it's time budget is 5 minutes. Yep.
I think if we change from AURZ to accuracy, the performance becomes bad. Is it correct?
So what sort of performance did you get?
It's 4.16 over operating systems.
Let me take a look. I think it
The previous problem was similar to that, but we'll switch to ACC. Yeah, yes. This is new. Let's see. Yeah, I think in general, the reason why you don't like to use ACC is because it's more discrete compared to video RC. Yeah, so I guess my point is that when we choose the reward, they do make a difference. Yeah, but in my mind, it doesn't look like this. It's better than this. I guess it's just a different machines. Yeah, or you can try to increase the amount of patients. So right now you see that it's the early software at episode 16 because the best model didn't increase. I see. If you increase the patients, the early software patients. If you sort of increase, it's not going to see what happens. I see overall for a longer time. I see. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question. How do you interpret this plot? It's just here it's saying loss and here it's saying loss instead of reward. So
Right, this actually should have been reward.
so the bigger the better.
Yeah, the bigger the balance.
I think we want to be out, but that's something often, that we talk about. Yeah.
Okay. So under the root umbrella, kind of do. See, that's the part I'm still confused about when you have like the loss function for like a reward function. For like, well, no, not a reward, but like a function for you to select what the next best architecture, right? So what exactly is happening under the hood? It seems to me that they're still searching for the best. Well, they're not searching for 300 something. It seems like they're only searching for like 300 something more. Because of the rate on the output. So do you know what exactly is happening under the hood? The two I'm sticking to.
So what's happening under the hood is we're modeling the architectures by a recurrent neural network with the name of a controller. That the controller itself is because it's a recurrent neural network has its own parameters. Right. So we initially those parameters are randomly initialized. So it just proposes architectural tokens uniform as I showed earlier. And then the question becomes how do we train this controller model so that it can propose better architecture, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now the question becomes how we train the controller. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So the way we train the controller model is basically by evaluating the architecture's reward it proposes, right? So for each architecture proposal, we evaluate the model's quality or performance, and then we use that reward to scale the gradients of this recurrent neural network. Because it's a recurrent neural network, we can compute this gradients with respect to directly the function of generating this architecture.
Okay. I guess what I'm confused is recurrent is has a time component to it. Well, in our case, time would be like step ones of
Yeah, I see.
layer 1, layer 2.
Yeah, that's the layer. Yes, the time actually is the layer. So I would actually think of this not as a time, but as a generating a sentence from a bag of words.
Right.
Right. So at each location, it's basically we are trying to selecting different layer types such that when at the end of this architectural token makes sense as a sentence.
So does that mean maybe they start with like, okay, well, let's look at the first layer, train all the model with only one layer for now, given all the choices of layer 1 that you put in your model space.
Oh,
and then it's update the gradient, and then they're like, okay, well now let's try the one with the biggest probability in layer 1, and then choose that.
not exactly. I think that's you can design your own search algorithm. I think it's a viable approach.
Oh.
But in this case, it's actually looking for local connectivity patterns. You know, like you're looking for, like if you have a convolutional as the first layer and only as the next layer, does that does this pattern happens in good synthesis or good architectures versus bad architectures? And now this is the thing is especially, I guess, important when you have like say 10 or 20 layers. When we only have 4, it's not that much to that, right? It's only 4 combination, like we were going through 4 layers. But when you have 20 layers, you're starting to see those local patterns of dependencies. And this sort of things are like deductive biases when introducing. So basically, we believe that the architectures should have this local dependency, right? So the selection of one layer should depend on all its previous layers. That's the bias we're introducing. It may or may not be the case, right? So if it is the case, our model will be very powerful. But if it's not the case, I think it leads to some model risk specification problems, which is typically seen in statistical model as well. Yeah. So this one, for example, in genetic algorithms, you're basically just treating each layer independently. Right? You sample, as you mentioned, it's a sample first layer, second layer, and you survive. You update your posterior probability based on some survived models. Yeah. And in this case, like again, just to emphasize, RNN is puts the bias that we think the layer has this layer was for all layers that comes before it.
You say layer one, it matters, the order matters, is that?
Yeah, the order values, yes. Yeah, especially like this section next layer with all of this.
Doesn't the order matter for all neural networks? Or maybe more so for the order of layers matters for any? Or the order of layers always matters?
Yes, right. This I guess this becomes a philosophical question about how what do you think is the most important thing tomorrow? And it's definitely right that the layer order matters for all networks, but it's our decision to whether to follow this factor. And in practice, I think, for example, if you ignore this layer-wise differences and just follow that as a like in the genetic algorithm, it also works. It's like I don't see a very rigorous comparison of different search algorithms. Yeah, and basically compare what sort of assumptions is more viable. Oh, and there are also like other, say, model architectures by graph neural networks. Right? Instead of treating this as a like a one-dimensional sequence, you're actually treating that as a network. Which may or may not be done, but you know, there's active research in both of these.
Okay, so I think we should resume in case no one is actually taking a break. But basically, I hope you were able to run this search process without any problems. Or if there are any problems, we can discuss now. I know that the accuracy didn't really work for you.
Oh, it works. I changed I changed the patients from 5 to 10, and then now
it works, right? Yeah. So the reason is, I guess the point is that when you choose different reward functions, it actually have different behaviors. And for AURLC, it's more continuous. So when you do this gradient updates, it may be better, right? It seems like it's better. And for accuracy, especially when you don't have a large enough data, the accuracy is sort of discrete, right? So it's like, for example, if you only have 100 samples, the accuracy could only be like 99 or 98, versus AURLCs, it can be more smooth than that. But I guess regardless, one of the take-home messages we should be able to get from this data-driven, unbiased neural architecture search process is that we want to understand what sort of operators is better fitted for our specific task. And whether we can actually use that insight to guide our future model building process. And this goes back to, I guess, the question earlier that how can we propose an initial good architecture? And this is part of the guidance, right? So we can look at the successful models that are out there, regardless if it's being designed by human beings or by this search process, and see when and where certain things are better than your specific data. I guess in this specific case, if you use my random seed, you should be able to see that in general, a larger kernel size is preferred for the first conv layer, right? So initially, I think it's a kernel size of 13 and 7 with a ReLU function is preferred, and somehow the initial preference of 13 kernel size starts to decrease after some search steps. And we incorporate some additional hyperparameters, right? We change this not just kernel size, but also the activation function from ReLU to 10H. And apparently, none of those 10H layers are being selected. It's just not good for your model's performance. But remember, this is specific to our own data set. For another data set, this may be different. And for the flatten layer, remember yesterday we have this flatten which converts your metrics, just like order them differently into a row, and global max pooling, global average pooling. And there was this point raised yesterday that global max pooling may lose information, which is true. But like in our specific case, losing information is actually good for your model's performance. It's so obvious that global max pooling is the way to go for our specific simulated data set, which is something like I guess even experts might not be able to recognize. Just because the way the data is constructed, and human brains are not good at looking at those 0-1 matrix. So you have to have this data-driven process. And just want to follow up this idea with a few of like either publications or papers that are under preparations. So for example, here we're analyzing these 12-layer deep residual convolutional neural networks. And we're visualizing the selection probability for each of those different operators across the first layer all the way to the 12th layer. And you can see that this red operator, which corresponds to a convolution with a kernel size of 8, is preferred from the beginning all the way to the middle. And after the layer number 8 or 9, it starts to decrease, and the probability of selecting the max pooling layer starts to increase. So first of all, the choice of a convolutional layer with a kernel size of 8 happens to overlap with the previous expert design choice, right? So the expert also tried a bunch of different models and decided that kernel size of 8 will most maximize the model's performance. And second, the reason why the selection of convolution starts to decrease, we can make some speculations, mostly because the model is already pretty complex after all those convolution operations. So starting from the middle part of this CNN model, it actually starts to use the max pooling to do this feature selection. In a way, it's losing information, but also it's regularizing the model. So what we can also do is we learn latent embedding vector for each of those operations during this search algorithm. Remember, this is a recurrent neural network. It's the same as a language model. We can learn the embeddings for each of those words. In our case, each word is a computational operation. So if we do a PCA on this learn embedding vectors, we see that some interesting patterns. First of all, on PC1, like identity is really standing out, right? So identity is really, really different from all the other computation operations, which is expected because it's not a computation operation. It removes a layer. And on the second PC, we start to see this interesting layout of max pooling, average pooling. So deconv means dilated convolutions. Just very briefly, dilated convolutions is doing convolutions like by a certain interval. The interval is determined by dilation rate. So what this does is it will increase the receptive field for a model in a way that's very similar to pooling. But at the same time, it also performs a regular convolution. So the fact that we see pooling and conv the two extremes of this PC2 axis with the dilated convolution in the middle kind of aligns with our expectation that dilated convolution increases the receptor field similar to pooling, but also does the convolution. So this means that we actually learned this embedding of different computation layers through this data-driven process.
I have a question. What that journal is Nature Machine Intelligence?
Mhm.
Is that,
Yes. Yeah, and I guess as I mentioned earlier, we can use this data-driven process to regularize overcomplicated manual architectures. So I hope you still remember this one. This is used to predict CRISPR-Cas9 off-targeting. It uses a receptor layer, which has a different kernel size. This branched architecture, followed by a bidirectional recurrent neural network. So what we do is we take the same data set and run this neural architecture search, right? So surprisingly, we found that even though we included the same inception layer, it's not actually being chosen. What is being preferred is a kernel size of 1 and 3, a very small kernel size. And we thought we can increase the model complexity by including a second convolutional block, right? But again, you can see this identity is being chosen. So really, like the model is being penalized for being too complicated. With the exception that this bidirectional RNN is really, really important. So we provide the option to remove this recurrent neural network, but this bidirectional layer with a higher complexity with the 32 neurons is really being preferred. So again, we can potentially get some insights from these architectures because these bidirectional RNNs are really modeling the dependencies of upstream and downstream sequence context. So the reason why this one is being preferred is sort of indicates that there are some context dependent effects when modeling CRISPR-Cas9. And indeed, in this paper that we're going to finish hopefully next month, we do some model explanation techniques and see that stretches of C and G's can actually increase the off-target probability in living cells. So that brings us to our last point for today. Yep.
I guess it's not so much removing, it's like skipping that, not adding.
Yeah, it's just skipping that layer. Yeah. Okay, so I guess that brings us to the last but not least. Is actually quite important. Is how do we interpret the trained model, right? Remember, we want to gain some knowledge by modeling those genomic sequences, and I guess convolutional neural networks or deep learning has long been thought as a black box, but I have to tell you that it's entirely not true today. We have a lot of arsenal of tools to interpret deep learning models and gain insights from that. And today we're going to introduce one of the most basic form of it. It's very useful, but there are so many more powerful tools out there to do this. And the method we're going to introduce is called in silico metagenesis. All right, so in silico metagenesis works when you have a trained model. So it basically introduces a mutation to your input DNA sequence, and such that we can compare the predictions for your like normal sequence versus this in silico mutated sequence. So the difference in your predictions will give you a hint of whether this mutation is detrimental or is just neutral. Yep.
For the ISM mutations to the input sequence, does it have like a reference database from like a program or things like that to like give rare variance mutations to the input sequences, and then like having some kind of references what this mutation will do?
No, we don't. Yeah, we don't actually do that because I think using population frequency is an orthogonal way to assess variant pathogenicity. But here we are actually not using that. We're doing this completely just unbiased data-driven way using our model. And here I put this CRISPR-Cas9 example here for a purpose to answer your question. Because like even though for a lot of human disease, we can use the allele frequency in normal populations as a hint for whether this variant is pathogenic. But for things like CRISPR-Cas9, because this, like we're repurposing a bacterial, molecule mapping towards genome editing, this doesn't serve the purpose. So in this case, we can still use a trend CNN model and then artificially introduce this genetic variations that are either seen in the natural population or they may be too rare to be seen in the natural population. We can always introduce that by one line of code and then assess whether this change of letter in your DNA will change the repair outcomes. I'm glad you asked that. I hope this is clear by this point. So basically, the repair outcomes, for example, how many times you will see a frame shift is actually dependent on your local sequence context. And biologically, this is because the sequence context will recruit a slightly different set of repair enzymes. Right. So I guess in summary, like this in silico mutagenesis is very, very powerful. First of all, it's because it's unbiased. It's not, we're not training on any of this observed variant effects. And second, it can be utilized to assess the effects of very, very rare mutations, and also in cases such as the genome editing, where it doesn't really correlate well with the allele frequencies. And a natural extension of in silico mutagenesis is called this saturated in silico mutagenesis. So the way it works is basically we exhaustively perturb every possible base pair in your DNA sequence, and the output is a matrix that has the same shape as your input sequence, because like we're at each time we perturb a base pair in your input, we got a score. This score is basically the difference between your original input sequence versus when you perturb this sequence. And apparently you will see a lot of zeros because when you perturb it to happen to be the same as your input sequence, there's no difference. And the output is typically look like this, right? You will have a highlighted region that when you change those DNA base pairs, they will have a big effect. So there's some pros and cons for in silico mutagenesis, right? So first of all, it's easy to understand. You just artificially change your input DNA sequence and measure the prediction differences. And more importantly, it's also biologically meaningful, right? It corresponds to introducing like single nucleotide variations or mutations. And this is something that you probably won't be able to do for example, for an image. This is very specific to DNA sequences. But there are also some limitations. For example, because we have to do this iteratively for every possible location and every possible DNA letter, it can be quite computationally inefficient. And there's some recent works that can reuse the like caching the results you're seeing and speed up this process. If you're interested, you can search online. They're mostly developed by Anshu's group at Stanford. And I guess the other thing is because we are perturbing one DNA base pair at a time, there's absolutely no consideration of how those features or DNA base pairs are interacting with each other. On a higher level, we will not be able to capture the motif interactions either, right? So it's literally just a single univariate interrogation of your trained CNN model. So okay, so let's move on to the last practice for doing this model explanation. And I was told that you should do this online QR code to fill out the feedbacks for this workshop. I think it will be very much appreciated and help make this workshop better in the future. We'll also we'll wrap up this workshop at 3:30. And for our online audience, if you have any remaining questions, now is the time to ask.
In the first block in the Insogo, what are the L1, L2, L3? Oh, level 1, oh, it's like it's like. The second best model is model 10.
I think that's the model of the depths.
Okay. What was supposed to run it? I think the fifth one added.
It's up to you. So it's not for you to do that.
It did, it would. Like, I could add the one in the work and four also. So it's probably just not.
Using an explorer. It's open. Even in whatever explore or data analysis you have to work. So for example, what you're really explore the space for basically an add-on for example, already the 10 inches are good for models. Perhaps you can consider it. I mean, in general, I don't think these are the extended practice questions are better. That's it's similar to research questions we're going to cover, right? So there's really no right or wrong answers. Using our judgment. Okay.
And how do you plot? I'm assuming that 50-second and analytics model explanation is also assuming figures that show which layers for each.
Oh, wait, actually, no. So if you go to the explanation section, there's a list, right?
Yeah.
So right now we're picking the fast model, number 1. So what the class is going to pick the second fast model to run this circle analysis.
Yes. I don't understand what this is telling us about the best model or how to interpret model explanation result.
Yeah, so basically it's told us if you change not this region. Yes, the darker the color is, we're computing the scores using the difference between the original sequence and the mutated sequence. So the darker the color, that means the probability of this being 1 will magically decrease.
Okay. So you're just saying, and our two models assign importance the same.
Right. Yeah. And then
Sure, here, but I guess like 5 and 4, it's not the same as ground 3. 5 is.
So remember that the motif is being added in the sequence, and we don't necessarily know where the motif is. Right. So you have to do some of that. It doesn't necessarily always.
The 10 here.
Right. So the G track seems to be pretty well. Yeah, that's why like you compare this focus region with the motif. Yeah, so like I guess the point is that we will try to use different models, even though the performance could be kind of comparable, we're asking different results from the same. So there's another layer of uncertainty that we have to consider. And it's making the part.
What's the advantage differences between ISM and SHAP? that also assumes something similar, right? Like it blocks that feature from participating in the model contribution. So it's like introducing like a stop coma or a permission mutation to that specific column and then evaluate its contribution.
Right, so that's, in a way, all our explanation have to be think of the recipe of a feature removal. But there's a after a review. There's a problem. What's it about?
The anesthesiologist. Yeah.
Yeah,
She did.
But all
Number of
things.
But there are different solutions to, like, for example, for the scenarios we are doing, story doesn't really matter. Very loud. But I think for a certain currently controlling the project, the top line is going to be because it's all rolling for itself. Brilliant, I don't think it's will be consistent. Versus a shop always considering the interactions of these game theories. Yeah, that's why I use cover yesterday too. But anyway, this is a simulated data, and we're taking around 200 base pairs. 0.01. So in real world applications, this could be binding or non-binding expression factor, given the 200 base pair genome sequence. Or it could be like epigenetic factors. Yeah, just all sort of modifications or bindings that are associated with DNA.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I think the recordings will be put up online next week. So yeah, it should be possible to watch this. I'm not sure how. Yeah, I think we've had several technical difficulties throughout the process, so I'm not sure how good the quality is. Yeah.
There is some other. To bring in the Amber model for, because when I tried putting in the ACC,
Right. It's not ACCs are like if you're just providing a string, it's not implemented yet. It does not know what ACC means. So you can always provide a custom callable function, right? So something like this. So you can define ACC as a lambda function. And they all should always take two arguments. One is y tree, the other is y score. Like it's maintaining a package is hard. There's so many things, little things like loss should be reward, and I should probably implement ACC, AUPR, ROC, and so many other things. So, but it's an open source, it's a community-based project. So, if you find it useful or you would like to open a pull request, it's always welcome. I guess it's time. So, if there are no more questions, let's wrap up this 2-day workshop. But basically for today, we introduced how reinforcement learning can be leveraged to train a model of the model, which is often called as controller, so that it can propose better architectures over time. And this process is typically called neural architecture search, or NAS, which can be automated, which can be used to automate the process of CNN tuning. And remember, this is not the only, by no means is the only search algorithm. You can do a lot of other things as well. And in the end, we also interpreted the model and sequence motifs for our best performing model. The reason is that we don't want to interpret a bad performing model because it's not going to be meaningful. So in summary, I think AutoML and its applications, especially in the realm of genomics and biomedicine, is only starting and is an exciting research direction. So I think it'll be really, really useful if you learn something in this workshop, or even better if you can apply this technique in your own research. And if there's anything, I'm always happy to discuss, and feel free to reach out to me. So yeah, that's the end of our workshop. And thank you for participating. All right, I'll stop recording here.